Welcome to another lesson on Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We'll be getting into Galatians chapter 2, finishing verse 14 and getting into verses 15 and 16. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we saw last lesson in verse 14, by Peter separating himself from the Gentile believers, not only did it cause the Jewish believers to follow his actions, but also it started Gentile believers into thinking that maybe they should also start observing the law. All right? Peter's actions would either turn Gentile believers into Jews, or it would cause the church in Antioch to be split into two different churches, a Jewish church and a Gentile church. And the principle of salvation by grace and also of fellowship between Jews and Gentiles was very much at stake. And this is why Paul had to deal with this issue that Peter was doing in Antioch. Paul had to deal with it to his face right away, because it was beginning to cause a disruption in the church in Antioch, and it was causing a separation. All the work that Paul and Barnabas had done in the church in Antioch between Jewish believers and Gentile believers, and the fellowship that they were having was beginning to be torn apart. Now in verse 15, Paul here says, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. When Paul uses this word we, he is referring to both he and Peter and any other natural-born Jewish person, okay? He says, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. Now, this phrase, sinners of the Gentiles, it was very common during Jesus' time and during the time of Paul and Peter for Jews to refer to Gentiles as sinners. Okay? In Matthew chapter 26, verse 45, and also in Luke 18, verse 32, Paul is referring to Gentiles as a whole. He's not talking about any specific Gentile person. He's talking about Gentiles as a whole. All right. So he says sinners of the Gentiles, and it's an offensive term, yes, but it was what was commonly thought back in those times, all right? He says, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. Verse 16, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Now, he says, knowing that a man is not justified. Okay, justified here is, the Greek word is dikaiao. And it's present, passive, indicative. And it means to be considered right. To make something righteous. To declare something righteous. All right? So he says here, knowing that a man is not declared righteous or made right. And present tense passive voice means that right now I have received the action of being declared righteous or being declared right before God. Indicative mood means it's a fact. It's a fact, all right? He says that a man is not justified or declared righteous by the works of the law, okay? In context, it refers to the whole law of Moses. All right? A man is not declared righteous before God by the law. And again, in the context of this verse, he's talking about the law of Moses. But for us today, who are Gentiles, it can refer to any church rules and regulations that we would think would help us to attain a righteousness before God, all right, or any kind of right standing with God. You must belong to our church. You must be baptized the way that we baptize people, okay? You must take communion our way, all right? You must observe the doctrines of our church. And if you don't, then God is not happy with you, and you might not make it to heaven. These are church rules, church regulations that affect us today, and this is what Paul is saying. Paul back then is saying to the Jew, a man is not declared righteous by the works of the law, but to the Jew he's saying by keeping the law of Moses. But to us as Gentiles, today, it's a man is not justified. A woman is not justified by keeping your church rules and regulations. Okay? Churches will say, you've got to be baptized this way. You've got to baptize children this way. Baptize adults this way. You have to have picnics this way. And perform this act that way. Every Sunday, we have to read a prayer from our founding fathers 375 years ago or something like that. And if you don't do it, well, God's not happy with you. And this is what Paul is saying. You're not justified by keeping church rules and church regulations. Okay? These are considered as modern day Judaizers. All right? They preach Christ crucified, dead and buried and resurrected, but Jesus Christ being crucified, dead and buried and raised from the dead is not enough. You must also keep a set of laws that you can't keep anyways. Okay? You've got to keep our church rules, and you've got to do it our way, otherwise God's not happy with you. And what is that? That's modern day Judaizers telling you that Jesus, believing in Christ alone, is not enough. You've also got to keep these rules and regulations. And that's a modern day Judaizer. All right? He says here, not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Righteousness with God is not by having faith in myself to keep a set of laws that no human in history can keep. Right? I can't keep the laws. No one can. The only person who did keep the law of Moses, the only person who did keep the law perfectly was Jesus Christ. And my faith, your faith, needs to be put in the person who did keep these laws. Okay? Romans chapter 2 verse 13 says that it is not what? It is not the hearers of the law that are justified before God, but the doers of the law that are justified. Okay? Paul said to the Romans, it's not just those that hear the law that are justified. If you truly seek justification before God by keeping the law, you better keep them all. Okay? It's the doers of the law that are justified. But no human being can keep the whole law of God their whole life. It's not possible. And here it is. The scribes and the Pharisees of Jesus' day thought that they were so righteous before God because they kept the laws of Moses every day. Their outward actions were beyond reproach. But Jesus showed them that they were not anywhere near as righteous as they thought. This and what I'm going to show you here in a minute is beautiful when we come to God by grace through faith in humility. Okay? There are many people who think that they can attain right. They're so righteous before God. And I'm sure you know people who are self-righteous. Well, I keep the law of Moses, or I keep our church rules. Look at him. He's such a good churchgoer. He does this and he does that, and he performs our church's laws and things so perfectly. Oh, I wish I was like him. Well, attaining righteousness doesn't come that way. You can keep them on the outside. The scribes and Pharisees, it looked like they were so holy and so righteous before God, but they weren't. Turn to Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to read one verse. And he says here, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28, but I say, let's start in verse 27. He says, but you have heard that it has been said of them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, the act of committing adultery. And verse 28, he says, but I say unto you, what? That whosoever does what? Whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her, what has he done? If he simply looks on her, and in his mind, not in his actions, in his mind, he thinks of committing adultery, it says, he looks on her, on a woman, to lust after her, what? He has committed adultery with her already where? In his heart. In his heart. If we think of a sin, it's not just adultery. Gambling, stealing, murder, whatever you think in your mind, you did it. Jesus takes sin to a whole new level. And this is how God sees sin. You see, we see sin as an outward action because I can't see your mind. I can't see what you think. It is not just our outward actions, but it goes all the way to the very thoughts of our heart. Jesus was saying to these scribes and Pharisees, you think you're so righteous because outwardly it looks like you're keeping the law of Moses, and I'm telling you, inside you're dead men's bones. God can see the heart. God can see the mind. Our actions come from our thoughts. Therefore, God sees the very core of our being, and he views sin there. He views sin here, not just in what we show on the outside. He views sin in the mind, in the heart. And he says, this is what Paul is trying to say here. He says that salvation, that justification, is not by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. It's not by keeping a set of rules and regulations. It's by coming to God by faith, because sin goes all the way to the mind. And we can't keep the law. Why? Because we have, not just because we can't keep it outwardly, but we can't keep it inwardly. In our mind, we sin in our mind, and that's where God sees sin. All right? Until next lesson, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.